So I am Gordy Habb, composer. Been composing music for a good part of, I don't know, maybe 35 years or something like that when I think back that far. But I grew up in Virginia, in a small town called Mechanicsville, kind of outside of Richmond, if anyone knows where Richmond is. Moved to Los Angeles about 25 years ago and have been sort of pounding the pavement ever since out here, just stirring up whatever I can. And I was very fortunate enough to find myself in the world of video games about 20 years ago, and it's been pretty fantastic for me. So
So I'm kind of curious when it comes to did you originally intended on going into video game composing, or was it just like, oh, I wanted to do this, but this opportunity showed up and might as well give it a shot?
yeah, I mean that's honestly exactly what happened. So I moved out to Los Angeles to go to University of Southern California to study scoring for motion pictures. So it was very focused on film. And that was my initial goal. It's like I just want to get into writing music for film, and that's my love. And and I had written the music for this short film that was produced and created by a couple of friends of mine. It was a Star Wars fan film called Ryan versus Dorkman 2. It's a sequel, and somebody at Lucasfilm had seen it and liked the music in it, and they were looking for a composer for an Indiana Jones game. This is like probably 2006 or 2007, so in that range. And I ended up getting hired to do my very first video game, which was funny enough, also Indiana Jones, and
Yeah.
led into my work with Star Wars, and they kind of just took off from there. So my initial goal was never to get into writing music for games. I honestly didn't realize that it was sort of an avenue for composers. At the time I got into it, it was really starting to kind of come onto the map as a medium that composers could write for, where they really put, a lot of attention into the music and recording with real orchestras and this kind of thing. That was sort of like that was new, mostly
Yeah.
like data of, like how much storage a disc could hold. You couldn't necessarily put a full orchestra recording on a disc. It had to be like FM synthesis that would, play chip tunes and that kind of thing. And that evolved so much in the early part of my career, and it became, sort of an avenue for composers to write symphonic orchestral scores, like I get to do very often in these games. So
I love that this all kind of stemmed from doing this short film
yeah,
inspired by Star Wars and being thrown into the world of doing Star Wars and Indiana
right.
Jones. Like
Yeah.
that's just insane that just something that was made as a fan being turned into an actual profession. That's kind of insane to think about that.
Yeah, yeah, it's very cool, and that's kind of how this business works. I mean, it's about, you always hear about, the business being about who you know, and there is a lot of truth to that, but who you know is who you've worked with. So I mean,
Yeah.
you have to work with people. You have to always see every relationship you have in the business is sort of an opportunity to lead to the next thing. And if you kind of go in there with that mindset, it really does open up a lot of doors. And that's the case here. I mean, these filmmaker friends of mine, they also went on to work for ILM doing, like visual effects and that kind of thing based off the same video. So we all sort of, kind of broke into the biz by making this little 5 minute long nerdy, lightsaber battle film, you know, and it really took off for a lot of us. So it's pretty cool how that works.
You started in this as somebody who was, a huge fan going into these projects, such a working alongside Lucasfilms and now both at Bethesda. Like, is there not any point where you're just like, holy shit, I'm still here. I'm still doing the things I like.
Oh yeah, for me, it's literally every day. So I mean, it was such a sort of happy accident falling backwards into video games, those many years ago. And every day I sort of thank the universe, so to speak, for that opportunity, and how it's turned into so many other great opportunities. And as a fan of the franchises I've been fortunate enough to work on, it is always like a daily sort of pinch myself moment. You know what I mean? It's like, wow, I get to work on Star Wars and Indiana Jones. These are the films and the franchises that really sort of shaped who I am as a composer. Because growing up with these movies, I mean, the music was highly inspirational to me even getting into music in the first place. So yeah, so there's never a day that goes by that I'm not fully aware of how fortunate I am in that regard, and it is definitely a
You
cool
know,
to be in.
from I would say from transitioning from movies into a game format, um, in the realm of music, you're competing against. Oh, are you competing mostly, or are you just helping translating what John Williams does into your film, into the game format?
Yeah, so I mean it's varied from project to project, but I would say like the more common approach now is that I'm writing completely original scores for these franchises, and because they have their own storylines and they're completely brand new narratives that are separate from the films. So the goal is always to write brand new music, new musical themes, kind of push the style forward into, sort of the modern era, but always with just enough of a bit of a callback to what made those original scores so great that John Williams wrote. So there, and it's varied. Like for example, Star Wars: The Old Republic. There's not a single note that references John Williams really in that score. Maybe a few here and there. But like over the course of like maybe I don't know, 15 hours or plus of music that was written for that game. Very little of it has anything to do with the themes from John Williams. Where Star Wars Battlefront, for example, was sort of 50-50. It's like I had to write a new original score that was for the action, the fighting in the game, but then also we had all these legacy characters from the films, which would have only made sense to introduce them with the themes that were written for them initially in the films. So,
Okay.
it was definitely more about like, sort of being a kid and finding that shoebox of your old Star Wars toys from the 80s and and just like getting to relive that nostalgia. So it was important to kind of fold in the John Williams themes there. But in the case of The Great Circle, there's only two themes that we used from the original films, and that's the Raiders March, which I think is what most people associate with being Indiana Jones's theme
Yeah.
itself. And then just there's like a momentary, hint to Marion in the game, and so we had to use her theme just a little bit there as well because it would be a shame not to. It's such a beautiful theme. But out of I guess something like 5 hours of music in the game, somewhere in that range, probably 5 minutes of it or something like that uses any of those themes from the original film. So it's a wholly an original score, but I'm always trying to pay homage to what made those films so great in the first place.
Now you mentioned it a second ago. This is 5 hours of recording of music that you're putting into this. In when it comes to kind of creating the composition for it, um, how do you keep yourself like, not say like entertained by the idea of that you're going to be doing this for 5 hours, but or
Yeah.
5 hours in recording wise, but just like keeping that like momentum going.
Yeah, I mean, with games, as opposed to, say, film, for example, because I work in film a lot too, games tend to have very long schedules for the music as well. So, I mean, it's pretty common for a composer to come on board a video game pretty early on in the production schedule, and the production schedules for games can be anywhere from like, 3 years to 5 years. So on a game like this, I was working on it essentially on and off for about 3 years. So I
Okay.
have the luxury of time, like when things get overwhelming or, I'm sort of like running out of ideas in this certain, like working with a certain theme or that kind of thing. I have the luxury of time to move on to something else different in the game and work on that for a while, come back to things, versus film where it's, I mean, you have 6 weeks to write the whole score, that kind of, it's much faster schedule and something I'm used to as well. But they both have the kind of their own unique challenges in that sense. But games is it's always it's a challenge, but it's a fun challenge to sort of manage the development of thematic ideas and the music itself over the course of like a very long experience for the end user because with the film 2 hours you're in and out probably maybe an hour, hour and a half of music, depending on the type of film. In a game, this game, for example, it's like a 20 plus hour experience for the
Yeah.
for the so in a way, we almost don't have enough music to cover it all. So there's a lot of like reusing things and recording things in ways where you can take out certain elements and then it kind of creates a whole new piece of music, that kind of thing. So we're doing a lot of that. But yes, in a sense, it's like it is so much music that yes, it can be challenging sometimes to not get bored of kind of staying in the same zone. But also having that luxury of time really sort of helps you kind of develop new ideas. And then the length of the narrative itself gives you like an opportunity to always kind of follow that narrative and come up with new things. So
So I'm kind of curious when it comes to the like composing, are you watching the gameplay footage as it's going? Okay.
yeah, it's a bit of both. So because again, like I was saying before, I'm coming on to I'm coming onto the production relatively early. So sometimes I'm on board a project before there's even any gameplay to look at, so I'll look at essentially like concept art, literal still images. Like this is what this environment is going to look like once it's finished. Here's a still image, so I can kind of get an idea of the mood, that kind of thing. I mean, on this game, I mean, I actually came on board when it was still very much in like a script, early draft script stage. So I was actually reading the narrative script and sort of like kind of you know like really wrapping myself up in the story itself, so I could really understand each character's arc and the importance from one character to the next and understand all the environments that I had to write music for. So before I'm even writing music, I'm sort of already sort of enthralled in the story itself, before I even see any gameplay. So writing a lot of themes for characters, themes for environments, that kind of thing, while the game is sort of being developed, and then we kind of meet in the middle at points. And then sometimes I'll see new gameplay and I'll look at it and say, oh, I had this idea for this, but now it doesn't quite work. So I'm like editing and changing. And so it's a lot of like going back and forth, iteration on the music itself as the game is being developed, which is, kind of unique for in games as opposed to film or TV when you're typically working to something that's already pretty close to a finished product. With film, it's like usually the last thing that happens on a film is the score is written, like
Yeah.
the relatively edited, sound design is kind of going in around the same time, but like you're looking at something that's pretty much close to a finished product. Where games, it could be anything from a script to, completely fully rendered cinematics that look like a film themselves. So it varies quite a bit.
I'm kind of curious because you mentioned about re-editing certain scenes. Was there any moment that you were like, I really want this to be in it, but I can't figure out how to put it into the game yet?
Well, not necessarily that, but I would say that there were a few occasions where I wrote a theme for a character that, as I learned more about the character, I realized that the theme was not, you know, appropriate for the character. For example, Gina, like the very first theme I wrote for Gina in the game, we ultimately ended up. Using as a different environmental theme instead because the more I learned about Gina, the more I learned that it was like she's very much this like adventurous character, much like Indiana Jones himself, and is kind of a badass that likes to go out there and explore the world, and like I felt like it needed more of this like tough kind of vibe to it, and like this very much like adventurer type of feeling. So I ended up rewriting the theme for Gina completely, and then we took what I had originally done for Gina and we used it for something different in the game. And that's common. That happens pretty often. So
Okay. I was kind of curious. I was like, well, you've already built up this character in your head, and now you're gonna put this character off to the side, or music-wise, for that theme for her into a different realm, which is kind of cool to know that you can still be able to reuse it.
yeah, I'm sort of always doing that because there is so much music in video games, particularly of games with this like sort of stature because they have, so much depth to the story and character that oftentimes I'll just sort of collect ideas that, maybe get rejected and I keep them in sort of like a bucket of things to revisit later. And, oftentimes, I'll go there first, like, so if I'm writing a new theme, I'll look in that bucket and say, is there anything in here that's already sort of, 70% of the way there, and I just need to edit it a little bit to make it work. And so I'll start from there. I'm always trying to find ways to use every note of music that was written along the course of the production schedule. Sometimes things just don't work, and don't be surprised if some of those ideas find themselves in another game down the line because they often do. But yeah, that's sort of a game for composers to play. This idea of like, trying to see how much of every note you write can find a home. As long as it fits tonally. So I'm constantly looking for ways to sort of take things that have already been written and edit them to fit.
Now, is there any moment in the kind of like finishing up phase where somebody's like, "Wait a minute, didn't you just reuse this for another character?"
No, it's one of those things that's always discussed, so it's not like just something that I would do on my own and try to pass it off as like, hey, look, I wrote this new theme. It's always like me talking to the audio director and saying, hey, I'm thinking of, sort of reviving this theme that I wrote, if you recall it from a year ago. And I'll send it over and say, here's a reminder. What do you think of this working for, the starting point for a theme for X character? So it's always sort of a thing that's pretty well communicated. Um, you know, I'm not necessarily trying to pass it off as something brand new, but it is this goal that everyone on the team has of trying to find homes for everything because, I mean, if it was written and inspired by the game, then it should probably find a home somewhere.
I was supposed to do this schedule this meeting with you like weeks ago, but instead I started playing the game and got distracted, and then was like, "Oh shoot, I was supposed to schedule this." Um, One of the things like I love about the game is the moments of having that movie element in it that you're going through pretty much the entire like gosh, the Raiders of the Lost Ark right there, scenes grabs from there. So when it comes to doing these cut scenes and then regular gameplay footage games, what was a little bit more challenging to do, the cut scenes or the gameplay?
For me, I mean, they both have very unique challenges, completely separate from each other. I personally find it easier to compose music to cutscenes. I mean, I think part of that's just my background in film comes into play. I mean, writing music for a cutscene is much like writing music for a film. I mean, it has a start point and an end point, and at this minute this happens, and so on. It's basically a timed out timeline versus gameplay, which that timeline can change completely based on the user's input. So, which creates this challenge of like having music be completely modular and interactive, but still feel musical. And that kind of creates its own set of challenges in a way. Oftentimes we'll record things in layers. So for example, if you're playing the game and there's not a lot of threat, so we'll have some action music playing underneath of it, but we don't want it to be too intense. Then we can pull out certain layers of the music, and as more threat comes into the scene, you fold those layers back in, and so it's sort of like kind of like a crossword puzzle with musical blocks in a way, and having this audio engine that can reassemble things based on our the design that I create with the music director in the game. Versus, cutscenes, they have the challenge to cutscenes is to hit the right emotional, beat. And so it is like scoring a film. There's nothing easy about it per se, but you don't have to worry about it being interactive. You can just write music for the sake of music to fit the picture, which I find a bit easier, as at least as a first draft.
In the game, you go through these cut scenes, and they're just like I said, it just feels like I'm watching the movie. It's insane right now in terms of how graphics are right now. The fact that it's like so lifelike.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
uh,
incredible. Yeah.
yeah, it's just incredible, and you're just kind of like thinking like, oh wow, am I actually? Did they just rip the clip from the movie and just slapped it in here? That's what it just feels like to me. And then going from that cutscene into actually taking part in playing the game, in being Indiana here, um, and feeling that motion kind of carry on through that cutscene into the actual gameplay footage wise. Um, I want to know in terms of just like the overall theme with the Great Circle, uh, going into it, um, was there like a set kind of tone message you wanted to have throughout the whole game?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there is. So part of the tone comes from the time period it's set within the franchise. So, the game takes place essentially in between Raiders and Last Crusade. So, like tonally, I knew I wanted it to at least, you know, harmonically and the type of orchestration I'm using needed to fit, the type of music that John Williams had written, in that era, so that it felt like it fit between those two films. So there's a bit of that, but also, I mean, I'm also always considering story. It's really just that's what it really comes down to is just narrative. So, I'm always sort of making choices that are based on storyline itself. Sometimes I have these great ideas of things I want to do, but it just doesn't fit, so I have to be willing to sort of sacrifice ideas for the greater good of the project itself. That makes sense.
No, no, it totally makes sense. Yeah, because that was like the one thing, going into any game is finding what the story is and how it relates to the whole centralized theme of the gameplay that you're playing. I
Sure.
mean, this is, and you're working on like probably the most coveted piece of work right now. It's Indiana Jones. It's a big deal to go and do a project like this, and then wanting to give it justice and still add that fun new twist to it of your own tone to it. It's exciting. I'm enjoying playing the game so far. Um,
That's great. Yeah,
do
very cool.
I am I bad at it? Yes. Yes, I am. I'm
Well,
horrible
you're
at
not the only one. I'm bad at it as well. So
it.
that's cool. Yeah, and you mentioned something before too, which I think is kind of an interesting point with these games and how great they look, particularly like the cutscenes. I mean, they're like the graphics themselves like feel like you're part of a film. I mean, but you take a game like this, and if you were to actually string together all of the cutscenes, I think it's like somewhere in the ballpark of like 4 hours of cutscenes, you know.
Yes.
And if you were to watch it top to bottom, it's the equivalent of watching two feature-length films worth of Indiana Jones, which is pretty incredible. And so that's always an interesting challenge too, because it's not just like, okay, now I'm going to score this cutscene. I have to write from point A to point B, and then that one's done. I have to understand where they fit in context of all of the cutscenes, because it really is like two feature-length films that have to have sort of a musical story arc that follow it. So I'm always, sort of acutely aware of where things are in the context of the full story and have to kind of, take that into consideration too as I'm writing. Like you don't want to overwrite a particular scene and then find out that, wait, we're actually building up to this and now I've kind of given it all away early. So, it's like this constant sort of, readjusting things so it feels like it has like a consistent arc that follows the story itself. This is
Yes.
all a unique challenge in games.
I would say, does it get confusing at times when you're doing these cutscenes? Just trying to make sure like where you're at on the board of like, okay, so A, B, C, D is right here though. D's here, but E is over here. And you're gonna make sure that E shows up somewhere back in the realm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that I'm constantly sort of remapping it out to understand where everything is fitting in context, and I mean, I always will go back to script if I have to. So, understanding like, okay, where does this really fit in the storyline? It's only like a 1 minute long scene, and I look at it. If I just looked at it on its own, it's like it's a conversation between, like Gina and Indy. It's nothing too spectacular. It's just two people talking. But I have to understand that the stakes are extremely high in this moment because of what happened in the previous, cutscenes that led to this moment. So like maybe the music needs to be even more intense, even though just in that isolated instance, it does not necessarily, call for over the top music. But I'm always looking at where is this in context. So for me, it's always kind of revisiting the narrative outline or looking at the script, the early stage scripts and just seeing where these things kind of fit in context, so I can understand that global arc that the whole storyline has.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this earlier. Do these scenes come to you in order? Like, do they send the clips over in order, or is it just like
No.
here's the
No, I've never received anything in order on any game I've ever worked on. It's always, and the cutscenes are usually the sort of the last thing that are happening in the game production schedule too, because, they take a lot of time to get the graphics just right. And then rendering out the graphics, is time consuming. So oftentimes I'm even like even if I'm working on a cutscene, I might just be working on something that's completely sort of what we call gray box. It's just black and white, boxes, and with like no backdrops whatsoever. It's just like, sort of animatic of the character, temporary voiceover, oftentimes done by like just people working in the studio. It's there, and we all know it's getting replaced later. So sometimes I'm working on stuff on that level because the cinematics themselves take a lot of time to get right. I mean, it's like animating like two feature films, kind of like I was describing before. So
Yeah.
that's happening along the way, and it's usually coming in hot towards the end. So, and oftentimes I'll get cut scenes I've already scored a year ago, and they'll send me a new one. It's like, oh, I have to re-edit the music because now that they put the graphics in, it's like it shortened it by this much here and there, or it may add some new context. Like I remember scoring one of the cut scenes in Star Wars Jedi Survivor. It was just a conversational cut scene. It was just two or three characters talking, and they're on like sort of the bridge of a ship, and there's like a window behind them. And I just scored it very underscored and kind of light, and tried to stay out of the way of the dialogue, not knowing that what I would be seeing in that window that was behind them was just the complete destruction of one of the characters' home planets. So it's like, and I didn't have that in context because those graphics were not complete yet. So that was one of those ones. It's like, I thought I had nailed it, and then we go back and look at it. It's like, oh man, I was not even close. I have to like completely rework it. So it's a constant kind of going back and forth because you're working in tandem with these other teams.
Honestly, if they didn't know, if they didn't tell you at all that there was going to be the explosion and you're just seeing this like, very happy, somber kind of feeling moment and you're watching the footage and you're like, wait a minute, why is there an explosion in the background? Everything's, and then the music is just this like, oh my gosh, it's so peaceful, very calm, whatnot, all is fine.
Yep. And of course, there's the case where I'd say, okay, I have peaceful underscore music that I'm putting in this bucket, and there might be a cutscene later that calls for that. Let's see if I can pull that back in and re-edit it to fit. It's no work lost is sort of my goal with these large scale projects because there's so much music. It's always best if you can like, try to avoid having to completely rewrite anything. So that's usually the case there, is I'm just like stockpiling ideas, and then I can always revisit.
That's good. Hey, so my big question of the day, because you've done a lot of games. How many of the games have you actually played?
I've played all of them.
You played all of them?
Game
Okay.
I've worked on, I always play the games. I mean, I get to play a bit of them as I'm going. I mean, some games more than others. Like I'll get a build and I'll be able to play in my studio, or in the case of the Respawn games, like the Jedi series, they're actually located in Los Angeles where I live, so I can actually go into the studio and play the game in the studio and see how things are working. But then after it's released, I'm always just I'm very curious about how the music is implemented into the game because, I'm flinging things over the fence for a couple years, and they're on their end, they're building this music system with everything I'm sending them. But, and I have a concept of how it all works, but it's always fun to see it actually in reality once the game is released, like how everything works. So I'm kind of playing it for two reasons. One, because the games I've had the privilege of working on are all really kind of cool and fun to play, and I'm a nerd and love Star Wars and Indiana Jones and and Halo. These are like, game franchises for me that are like, I would play them if I wasn't working on them. So, so I get to kind of nerd out in that regard. But then I'm also like just very curious to see how like all that work kind of got put into play. And I can learn from it as well.
Yeah.
Like I'll find things that I think could have worked better, and I just make mental notes of that. Like next time I do that, I need to like build a like a vertical layering system for this type of cue, musical cue, or something like that. I'm always just kind of thinking about the next project, and so seeing the final work is in many ways a sort of opportunity to, have like a postmortem on my own work and say, what could I improve on next time?
Well, that's good to know because I'm always wondering when it comes to, creating something and knowing that it's like out in the open and you're like, should I relive my moment and play the game and see how I feel about it now after time has passed? So that's
I
good.
kind of enjoy that personally, and I enjoy having a lot of time sort of, between me and having worked on the game and then playing the games as well. Like when I started working on this game, I actually broke out my old Wii. I can't save every console I've ever had. So, I have like a wall of game consoles. And so I broke out my old, like first gen Wii and put in the very first game I ever scored, which is Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings. And I played it because I wanted to see now, 15 years down the line, having scored, a lot of pretty big Star Wars games in particular, but like certainly games that are based in like franchises with large over the top scores, like what's evolved in my own writing since then? What could I do better than I did the first time? And I look back on that stuff and I'm always like, oh God, what was I thinking? It's like, because, I firmly believe in like, I'm a student for life. And so I'm always looking to improve my own work. And, so sometimes going back and playing old games, I'm like, oh yeah, I could have done this better. Well, next time I'm in a similar situation, like what can I do to kind of improve on that? So I'm looking at it that way as well.
I have to ask this just because, you've been doing this for quite some time and you've worked with Lucasfilm for such a while. Have you met George Lucas?
Yes. But not in like an official capacity.
Just like a nod, like, hey, sup.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was recording music for, actually, I think I was recording music for Halo. It's either Halo
Ooh.
or Star Wars: Old Republic. I don't remember which one, but we were recording it at the recording studio at Skywalker Ranch. And so, when you take a lunch break at Skywalker Ranch, you go to the main house, which is George's house, and so there's like a cafeteria in there. And I remember sitting down, just having a quick lunch, and I had like maybe 15 minutes where I had to be back in the studio ready to go, and so I'm just there by myself, and I look, and there's another guy sitting all by himself, and I'm like, wow, this guy takes his job really seriously, like he even dresses like George Lucas. And then I look closer, I'm like, wait, that is George Lucas just having lunch all by himself. So I went over and just said, hey, I'm not going to bother you, man. I just want to say hi and thanks for everything you've done because I'm a huge fan. We're over here recording music for, a Star Wars game, just I'm here for that. And, thank you. And he was just very, gracious and, you know, glad you're here. Hope you enjoy yourself. But that was
I
the
love
extent
that.
of it, which is about the same extent of to which I've met John Williams. The only time I've actually met John Williams was that randomly when I moved to Los Angeles 25 years ago, I was shopping
Really?
at Costco. Yeah, I was just in a Costco buying like bulk paper towels or whatever, and sure enough, there's John Williams and Yo-Yo Ma sitting in the center of Costco signing CDs because apparently at that time Costco was like one of the number one retailers of like physical,
Yeah.
media. And so I just ran to the CD section and tried to find any John Williams thing I could find and bought a copy of Jaws, like my fourth copy, and got in line and got to meet him and was like, "Hi, I'm a composer." He's like, "Oh, good luck," and that was the end of that. So, fast forward 20 years, who knew I'd be like working on all these franchises that he sort of penned the original scores for. It's pretty incredible to think about.
I'm surprised that he hasn't like made contact with you since knowing like that you were working with his, you know,
Yeah, no,
themes.
there was a period of time where he was at least, sort of indirectly involved. So the Battlefront game series, for example, he was everything goes through an approval process, anything I write. So the studio hears it, they check it in the game, see if it works, and sometimes I have to rewrite. And then once everyone in the studio's happy, then it gets sent to licensing, which is in this case Lucasfilm. And they have a whole department of a music department that listens to music that are written for any Lucasfilm property and make sure that it fits the brand properly. And on the Battlefront games, it took a step further and it would go to Disney for approval. And then the final step was to send it to John Williams, and he would actually listen and, give the official sign off on anything that had to do with, particularly anything that had to do with his themes, which Battlefront had quite a bit of that. So yeah, so that was like, I did have like one phone conversation that he was involved in when we were talking about like how I would treat Kylo Ren the theme, for example, and he had some ideas on like, which instruments to use and not use. And so I got to hear him out on that. But that's about the extent of like his involvement. Most of the time, I think he just kind of says, sounds great, and it's done,
Just
which is
small
kind of
little
cool.
check mark. Yeah. All
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah,
That works. Little thumb up, maybe.
yeah.
I love that though. At least you had the opportunity to meet him in the most unusual, fun spot to ever.
Yeah, exactly. So.
So we're kind of come down towards the end. I'm curious to know what kind of future projects you're working on that's not NDA, covered by an NDA, I should say that.
Yeah, yeah, of course. So, everything is always covered by NDAs, particularly in the game side of things. But
Yeah.
one thing that I do have coming out very soon, next month, is the sequel to a film series that I've been working on called Creation of the Gods. It's a Chinese, like sort of larger than life fantasy. I guess like the closest equivalency would be like, like Lord of the Rings trilogy,
Okay.
so, and it's huge in China and they're releasing internationally. So I did the first film, which came out a little over a year ago. And I just finished scoring the second film and it comes out on the 29th of January in
Ooh.
this month. So that's coming out. I'm really excited about that. It's a great film. We wrote this gigantic 3-hour score for it. So there'll be a soundtrack album for that as well. And yeah, so that's all I can talk about officially, but
Yes.
yeah, because it's done and it's coming out soon. But everything else obviously is always sort of top secret. But there's a couple that I think, when the world finds out, it will not be that big of a shock that I'm working on. So a few
I
things that will be somewhat obvious once they are announced, I
I
suppose.
am curious, are you still going to be working with Bethesda?
I hope so. Yeah. There's certainly talk about doing, maybe some DLC or something along those lines. So, working with them on anything to do with Indiana Jones, I'm on board for, and I really enjoyed working with Bethesda. So hopefully, there's something in the future that we can work on together.